It's a great honor to serve as the keynote speaker for this event and have the opportunity to present what I hope will be a step forward in the study of immigration and integration. My only regret is that the Estonian Philharmonic is now performing at my university in California, so I can't hear them here nor there. As co-director of the Immigration Policy Lab with branches at Stanford University and ETH Zurich, allow me to introduce you to our history and our mission. First, for the history. Some of you may know my work on the Russian-speaking populations in the Soviet, quote-unquote, near abroad started in the early 1990s, when I dropped all my other research to say this is one of the most exciting moments in the 20th century, the restoration of independence of the post-Soviet republics. And allowed me, as a year-long resident of Narva-Jõesuu, to observe at the very early stages the crisis that would hit all of Europe and the United States in the next 2 decades, how to integrate non-titulars into modern democratic societies in a way that benefits them as well as the communities in which they live. Some of you may know that the book that came out of that research project, called Identity Information, examined the trends for the Russian-speaking populations in Estonia, Latvia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, revealing the different modes of incorporation into the post-Soviet republics. Subsequent to that research, I spent nearly a decade studying the barriers to successful integration of Muslims into France, leading to a book, Why Muslim Integration Fails in Christian Heritage Societies, and also on how these barriers to successful integrations of Muslims into European societies might be overcome. In the past few years, I teamed up with my colleague Jens Heimmuller, who came to Stanford several years ago, and Dominique Hangartner, now at ETH Zurich, both of whom were studying popular attitudes in Europe towards refugees and immigrants. One of the exciting things about this research is that European populations are far more open to refugees than the popular press suggests they are. They use sophisticated statistical techniques to measure the effects of immigration policies on the life prospects of immigrants and refugees. And we jointly built a lab to enhance the range of these investigations, and thus to our mission. As many of you know, a staggering 65 million people worldwide have been displaced by poverty, by violence, and by persecution. Immigration issues have roiled American politics and is challenging the unity of the European Union. In these hotspots and beyond, policymakers have little trustworthy research to guide them, and public opinion is easily clouded by misinformation and partisanship. These challenges can seem insurmountable, but there's no reason why immigration policy cannot benefit from the same kind of ingenuity that has brought us dramatic medical advances and game-changing technology. And this kind of research is long overdue. That's where the Immigration Policy Lab comes in, using large data sets, creative research designs, and cutting-edge analytical tools. We hope to bring new evidence to bear on the urgent problems practitioners in ministries, in international organizations, and in non-governmental organizations that they all face. By guiding the people who set public policy, as well as those who directly serve immigrant communities, our research can inspire solutions and maybe, hopefully, improve countless lives. So, when we created the Immigration Policy Lab, we realized that scientific progress on the successful integration is compromised without a clear agreement as to what constitutes success and how it is to be measured. And thus, the goal of this paper that I'm going to describe to you today, recently published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences only about 2 weeks ago, is to propose a standard measure of integration, defined as the degree to which immigrants have the knowledge and the capacity to achieve success in their host society. And after 3 years of proposing and testing and using all sorts of techniques to work out a common measure, we now have this measure. We call it the IPL, Immigration Policy Lab, 12 questions. And it is justified and tested in this Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences paper, the source of the keynote address today. How come after all these years, there is no standard measure for integration success? And I think there are 3 reasons for this. One is people have a hard time agreeing what integration means. And I'm sure you're going to be debating that for years here. What do we really mean by integration? And if we can't agree about what it means, it's very hard to think of a tool to measure it. Secondly, almost every country in Europe, including Estonia, has state and academic research on integration, each using its own measures. And therefore, it's impossible to compare how well, say, the Algerian immigrants to France are doing compared to the Turkish ones in Germany, because the measures are completely different across the different countries. And the extent to which everyone is using their own measure, there's no way to say, we're doing this better than most, or we're doing this worse than most. We have no standard. Thirdly, the field, for many good reasons, is mostly dominated by qualitative researchers, people who bring insight into particular situations of particular groups' lives and the difficulties they face. And this is valuable information, but not particularly useful to make comparative statements about the success of policies and measuring the success of policies. So, thus our concern to actually get a measure that we can all agree upon. So what's the criteria for a useful measure? We have 7 criteria. First, the measure must have what we call construct validity. Will those we know who are doing better, integrating better into society, get a better score than those we know who are not getting a good measure? If it doesn't actually measure what we think it's measuring by, let's say, a group that just came to the country 6 months ago getting a higher score than people who've been in the country for 5 years, we would say this measure lacks construct validity. Second, there must be clear directionality, that is, from not well integrated to highly integrated. The better able you are to read the official language of the state, the more we can say you're linguistically integrated. But suppose we said levels of trust, from low trust of others in your society to highest trust. The problem with that as a measure is that low levels of trust may reflect poor integration, but unstinting trust may reflect passivity and lack of critical sense of your government or your fellow citizens. So it may be that medium levels of trust is ideal, and it lacks the clear directionality of integration. Third, and something we consider quite important and has been discussed by the minister before, is that integration does not mean assimilation. So what do I mean here? There's no presumption that the cultural repertoires of the dominant group of the host society are a model for integration. So eating kilovojve, a sprat sandwich, is not a criterion for successful integration into Estonia. That you can have your own foods, your own cuisine, your own style of life, and I think that leads to multiculturalism, which many of you believe is something that's an ideal. But nonetheless, if you are interested in the capacity and the knowledge to succeed in Estonia, we can agree that's something we want all Estonians, all citizens of Estonia to achieve. Fourth, the measure must be successfully employed across societies and over time. It has to be culturally neutral, so we can use the same survey in Switzerland, in Germany, in Estonia, and the United States. So certain questions often are asked in Sweden Do you vote in local elections as a sign of integration? Would be a great question, except in the United States, no immigrants are allowed to vote in local elections. So it would be a useful question for Sweden, but not useful for the United States. And we want questions that could be used in any of the host countries. Fifth, it has to be administered through, I should go back here, sorry. Fifth, it can be administered through different media. So we've run our survey by phone, by internet, and face-to-face surveys. Because different groups will require very, very different media of transmission of the survey, and it has to be usable in all of these different media. Sixth, there has to be questions that can be answered by all subjects. One of the questions I asked in much of my research was, what language do you speak with your children? That gives you a tremendous amount of information about your integration in the society. But many, many of the respondents don't have children. So to create an index in which everybody can answer every question, we can't ask questions that some people say, sorry, I don't have children, or I can't answer that because it's irrelevant to my life. And finally, the measure must have face validity. Do our questions measure what we agree as integration? And therefore, we go around to different communities and say, if we ask this question, does this make sense to you as something that reflects higher levels of integration? So these 7 criteria were the ones that guided us in our quest for a unified measure. So what did we do? We reviewed more than 50 surveys on integration. I'm going to just show you the list, but get right back. Oh, maybe I can't get back. Let's see how I can. Oh, I think I have to go way down to get back here. There we go. We reviewed more than 50 surveys on integration. Then we selected more than 200 questions from all these surveys with the potential to differentiate between high and low integration. We tried to focus on questions that are also relevant to other research fields so that people could use our questions and test for other things beyond or different from integration. That was better. And finally, we searched for a limited number of dimensions where there are expectations of differential rates of integration progress. And this is very important because we wanted this survey to be used everywhere in all other surveys. And we tried to get it as compact as we can, the fewest number of questions to give us the most amount of information. And I'll get to that again. So we found through the research that we did of all these 200 questions and from the 50 surveys, we found 6 dimensions of integration success. There's navigational, political, linguistic, psychological, social, and economic. Let me say something about political integration because it helps me highlight why we don't mean assimilation and how we differentiate integration from assimilation. On political integration, we at the lab often get asked if rooted Americans are politically integrated if we were to use an assimilation measure. The problem we faced is that most rooted Americans have no interest in politics and no knowledge of politics. So would we say someone is more integrated in America if they were ignorant of politics and didn't participate? We decided that wouldn't make sense. What we decided to think through is that most Americans are not integrated politically. And it could be that early citizens or new citizens are more integrated politically than our American citizens. So in a sense, this is a clear case where non-assimilation leads to higher levels of integration. So I'm going to take you through what we call the IPL 12, the 12 questions which we believe is a measure that could be used anywhere and be able to be comparatively studied if state statistical bureaus, ministries of culture, and sociological researchers all would tag these 12 questions onto their annual or regular surveys. So on the psychological dimension, we ask, what is your connection to your host country? I feel extremely close connection, I feel very close connection, or I don't feel a connection at all. Then we say, the second question on psychological, do you feel like an outsider? How often do you feel like an outsider in your host country, going from never to always? So those are the only two questions we ask for the IPL-12 on psychological. We have two more questions for what we call the IPL-24, and I'll explain where those 12 extra questions come in later. For economic, we ask about household income. What is your household's annual income? And we have a series of ways to get people to sort of estimate that income, and also their employment status, whether they have a job, whether they're retirees, whether they're students, or whatever. And employment status is the degree to which you are actively engaged in the economy of your host country. For political integration, we ask the degree of subjective knowledge. How well do you understand the important political issues facing the United States, from very well to not well at all? And we ask for second question on political. In the last 12 months, how often did you typically discuss major political issues facing the host country with others? For social integration, going back to Max Weber, who wrote a great deal about commensality, we ask, in the past 12 months, how often did you eat dinner with Americans who were not part of your family? That turns out to be a very, very useful question in seeing how well people are integrated. Social contacts is the second social question we ask. Please think about Americans in your address book or your phone contacts. With how many of them did you have a conversation, either by phone, message, or chat, in the last 4 weeks? In the linguistic integration, we ask about reading level. The way we ask the reading level question is, I can read and understand the main points in simple newspaper articles on familiar subjects, from very well to not well at all. And a similar question about speaking level. Navigational is one we added late in the process as we realized being able to do things in the country like seeing a doctor or finding a job, and how well people are able to navigate their country is something of immense importance for success in their host country. So once we got going with these dimensions, we did preliminary data collection in 5 different surveys in Switzerland and United States and with different immigrant communities. And then what we did is for the final instrument, we used what we called a contrasted group approach for purposes of construct validity. We took groups that we thought were highly integrated and groups that we thought were very poorly integrated, and we wanted to see whether our measure actually captured these differences, or all the groups would look the same. So we went with 406 high-income immigrants on YouGov, which is an internet platform. And there we got, on average, people who are 60 years old with 35 years of residency in the United States. And on the other end, we went to a group in the peninsula in the San Francisco Bay with an adult education program run by a group called Allies for immigrants who were taking English as a second language course. And quite different from this first group, the average age was 40 years, the residents in the country less than 5 years. And in between, we had well-integrated group from Germany doing the survey through the internet, and then low-income immigrants eligible for naturalization in New York, which are slightly more integrated in our expectations than that last group of the ESL students. And we have an ongoing data collection project working with OFPRA, the Office of, in France, of Refugees and stateless peoples, who are now using our survey to test how well their refugee populations are working, with a very close relationship with the OFPRA office in France. So, early samples to cull down our questions started with around 60 to the goal of 12, and we learned a whole lot by running these early surveys. So I'm going to go back to this contrasted groups approach, and what we see is the YouGov group, the one on, will this allow me to, I'm afraid to use this. The YouGov group on the left, you can see that they had the highest levels of integration, just as we expected, and the Allies group on the far right had the lowest levels of integration, assuring us of construct validity, but also because the Allies group did it all in 4 different languages on paper, whereas the YouGov group did it in internet. It showed that this is feasible with a whole different approaches towards giving the survey. You will see that the IPL 12, which is on the left of each of the 4 groups, and the IPL 24, the one next to it, the results are almost exactly the same with IPL 12 and 24. The major difference for those who are statistically inclined is that the standard errors in the 24 are much lower, meaning it's a more precise measure, but the mean scores were virtually the same. So we were well assured that we were measuring what we thought it was measuring. So as for correlations, what we found is that if we just look at the very top, that doesn't come out very well, the very top row is age, and that line going down the side is whether there's a difference between one group and another group. And we see that on age, it's just on the line, meaning that no matter what age you are, it makes no difference on your successful integration. The next row is gender, and we find females and males do about the same, controlling for the other factors. Education, however, the more educated they were when they came to the country, the more successful they are controlling for age and gender. If they had the language of the host country, they did much better, as we would expect. The numbers of years of residency predict successful immigration. And the last 2 rows are whether they have legal papers as permanent residents or legal papers as naturalized citizens. And those who have better legal status have much higher scores of integration. All of which we would expect. So in a sense, this is a demonstration of construct validity, that the measure is measuring more or less what we'd expect to happen. One of the interesting things we learned looking at all our survey respondents from the 4 big surveys is that the number of years of the country, which is on the x-axis, and integration score on the y-axis, what we see is after 30 years in the country, each additional year gets you no more integration. So you keep on average, you keep on doing better on the integration score for the first 30 years in the country, but then it flattens out. The correlation between IPL 12 and IPL 24 is almost exact. As indicated earlier, this plot shows that we can rely principally on the IPL 12, which means that we can get a valid measure of integration success in basically 10 to 15 minutes of survey time. In France, the famous Trajectoire et Origine survey has a wealth of questions, allowing for 1,500 variables. on sources of income, on nationality of parents, on language, on migratory trajectories, on family relations, on self-image, on education, on professional life, on religion, on marriage, on citizenship, on health, on perceived discrimination, and on social relations. 1,500 variables. I don't know how they would get respondents to last that long through these surveys. These are terrific to understand the mechanisms, but not very useful on knowing the success rate of French immigrants or immigrants to France compared to the ones in Germany or compared to the ones elsewhere in Europe. Although the IPL-12 and IPL-24 correlate nicely, there is some fascinating variation that we learned across the dimensions of our respondents. So they all didn't work together at the same rate. An excellent example comes from our ALLY survey of Silicon Valley English as a second language students. That was the contrasted group that was least integrated. What we found is that many of these students in the classes were spouses of high-tech immigrants. They received the highest scores on economic integration because their spouses were earning a great deal in Silicon Valley, but very low scores on linguistic and social integration. They were psychologically and socially isolated. And that's something, this divergence teaches us a lot about integration processes and are very useful for social policy design. In fact, we're now working with the state of California to develop integration programs to remedy where specific groups fall behind on one or some other dimension and how this can be remedied. The road ahead. First, we seek buy-in from state statistical bureaus, and one of the reasons why I'm here and so happy I'm here is to try to convince those of you working on the integration projects in Estonia to adopt this measure. An added 15 minutes of questions would get you a good deal of comparative evidence of how well you're doing compared to other host societies. Second, and I think this is even more important, we want to initiate or ally with government agencies to promote integration so that we can run randomized controlled trials on their programs. What do I mean by that? We're now working with the New York State Office of New Americans, and we wanted to learn whether citizenship had value for integration. That's a very tough question. Most previous studies compared legal permanent residents, LPRs, who were eligible for naturalization but did not apply for it, compared them with legal permanent residents who became citizens. And what they found is that those who became citizens did much better. But you see why this evidence is flawed. Because the people who applied for citizenship were not the same did not have the same personal characteristics as those who didn't apply. The ones who applied were probably more ambitious. And therefore, the result of their success may be because of the ambition they had that led them to apply for citizenship. That's an inferential error in the approach. Those who apply for citizenship have qualities like ambition at higher levels than those who don't apply. Therefore, there's bias in the selection of the samples. So what did we do? We're now running a randomized controlled trial in New York State. What we did is we ran a lottery among financially strapped eligible legal permanent residents to pay the $740 fee that the Americans charge for citizenship application. All those who applied for this lottery were equally poor and equally desirous to get citizenship, because applying for the lottery took some time and some effort. We are now comparing the winners who got citizenship with the losers who were much less likely to apply for citizenship. In a couple of years, following these in a panel survey over a couple of years, we will have a well-specified measure of the effect of promoting citizenship on immigrant integration. This is the kind of randomized controlled trial that we want to promote with other NGOs and government agencies. If they have ideas on how best to promote integration, we can run a randomized controlled trial to see if their ideas actually bring about what they think they will bring about through modern methods of, we'll call them modern methods of experimental design. For full information about the measure, the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences paper implementing, and you can implement the program, and also you can score yourself on the integration measure on our website. And whether you're not an immigrant or not, online you could see how well the survey will work for you. It's an immigrationlab.org. Is this relevant for Estonia? Well, no significant, well, I shouldn't say that. There's some immigration since the restoration of statehood in 1991, but it's not gigantic. Although in the past couple of years, there's been a jump, which I recently learned about. But many of the Russian-speaking population have immigrant roots coming from the Soviet period. How well are they integrating? And where in society are the successes and where are the failures? Are the predictions that I made in the book Identity Information that Estonia and Latvia would be integration successes compared to the other former Soviet Union republics? Will that be upheld if we ran this measure across the so-called Russian-speaking populations in the former Soviet republics? That's exciting research to be done, and I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you. If we have any questions, please raise your hand. We're going to bring you the microphone. Yes, we do have there. We have a...
Raibovetic.
Yes, here we go.
Thank you, David, for your excellent presentation. I have a question about one of the key principles you mentioned in the beginning, and it was that the cultural repertoire of majority group should not be regarded as a model for migrants. At the same time, everybody knows that integration presumes also certain homogeneity. So your principle is that cultural repertoire of locals should not be model for migrants, but how about achieving homogeneity?
One of the exciting questions, I know that Keith Banting is here, who works on this and this is a model for this kind of question, is the following. The degree to which people assimilate into the cultural repertoires of the dominant population, does that lead to greater integration success or not? In other words, does a multicultural policy bring greater success for the immigrant community or the immigrant communities? A policy of multiculturalism which celebrates heterogeneity culturally, or would it be assimilationist policies that bring greater capacity and knowledge to succeed in the host society? And I want to remain agnostic on this issue and ask, under what conditions does assimilation bring higher levels of integration? And we don't really know the answer to that. So if you put in your measure of integration, the degree to which there is cultural similarity or cultural homogeneity, we would never be able to ask the question, does cultural homogeneity lead to successful integration? Because the measure of cultural homogeneity would already be embedded in the measure of integration. So I want to separate those two out to ask the question on the degree to which assimilation is useful for successful integration. I will say, as one aside here, there are certain cultural repertoires which are necessary for successful integration, that is, speaking the dominant language of the state. But different from the assimilationist point of view, if the immigrant population remains at home speaking their home language, but capable of speaking the host country language at work or in public affairs, that would be considered a successful integration by our score, but not necessarily successful assimilation because they're maintaining cultural repertoires of their home society.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, we have over there. If you identified yourself also, please.
Yes, hi, my
Thank you.
name is Petar. I'm from Finland and I'm going to be one of the speakers of tomorrow. About dimensions you presented, I have a qualitative question. Would you put them in any order, like in time or in value? Which comes first, which is more important of those you explained, which started with psychological and ended with navigational, if I remember correctly. Would you say what comes first and what is not less important but comes after? Thank you.
We never made a hierarchy of these 6 dimensions. What we found is that, as I said before, that certain groups do extremely well on one dimension but poorly on others. And we're still trying to investigate why this occurs. Right now in California, there is a big move to press for navigational integration, to help the immigrant communities to learn how to use the hospital system, learn how to use the transport system, to learn how to register for food stamps, and all these kinds of things. It turned out that that's something they consider of great importance. So we're working with them to implement what they call an e-civics program, which is basically navigational. So we want to work with practitioners in the different societies to say, what do you think the principal problem is here? Or we can learn what the principal problem is sometimes from the actual survey, and then see if we can design programs that speak to this issue, and then use randomized controlled trials to see if our solution works.
Yes, we have another question over there. Can you keep your hand up, please? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Victoria Preston. I'm from London. I'm running a panel tomorrow. I had a question about gender. I was the chair of governors of a school, primary school in East London when my kids were young, a long time ago, 30 years ago. And one of the issues that we had there, in which the indigenous East End community was in the minority, and we had a lot of Bangladeshi and Somali kids, is that the mothers did not speak English. And so it was very, very difficult to integrate the East End kids with the Somali and Bangladeshi kids, because there was no conversation between the mothers at the school gate. You could never invite those children home for tea or any of those things. Did you have any gender dimensions in your studies, in your model?
Yes, it's an excellent question. Did I actually spend some time in North London with my next door neighbors in Somalia when I lived there, who are now in North London, and our closest friend, the mother, did not speak a word of English, had been in England for 12 years, and their children were getting first degrees in school, so it didn't hurt them that much, the children. But I would say that the degree to which the women are isolated, as the case of our Allies program, is certainly an issue that would be an example of the failure of integration. And so I don't see why Somalis or Bangladeshis should want to go to pubs and eat whatever English people eat in pubs. I wouldn't expect them to do that, because that has nothing to do with the capacity or the knowledge to succeed in England. But I would expect them and see it as important for integration that they speak English, the language of the dominant group. And the degree to which they are not being pushed in that direction, as the French do for their immigrant communities, I think is a challenge for the UK. I should say that when I was doing my research in France, I had to go through to get my immigration papers for a long-term work permit. My wife had to go through that same process, and she would get 400 free hours of French instruction by virtue of the fact that her spouse had a job at Sciences Po. And this is what the French call the contract of assimilation and integration. Of welcoming and integration, not assimilation. But in many ways, that's a terrific model.
Now, we are pressed for the time, so I'm sorry we need to cut it short. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Professor Leighton, thank you. And maybe